All right, so buenos dias. Thank you so much, Leonardo, for that introduction. Thank you also to Fräulein for the invitation and the hospitality over the last couple of days. For those of you who don't know me, in what I hilariously refer to as my spare time, I've been a core developer on the Django project since January of 2006. I was president of the Django Software Foundation from 2010 to 2015. For those who haven't come across it, the DSF, Django Software Foundation, is the IP, legal and fundraising arm of the Django project. But as Leonardo said, more recently I've been spending most of my time working on the Beware project. Beware is a project exploring the tools that we use as developers to write software in Python. It aims to provide cross-platform tools and libraries to enable the easy development of native cross-platform user interfaces on all modern computing devices, so laptops, but also mobile phones, tablets, set-top boxes, watches, things like that. I'm extremely lucky that I'm now paid to work on Beware part-time. Jambon Software have hired me recently on a contract that gives me a significant guaranteed portion of my time to work on Beware. So, as you might guess, I'm a big fan of Python. I'm not alone in that. This room is filled with Python enthusiasts. Now, while my personal resume is filled with mostly web and mobile projects, Python as a language has much broader appeal than that. There's a huge breadth of domain knowledge that's encoded in Python. Projects like NumPy, SciPy, Jupyter, BiPython, AstroPy. There's a wealth of scientific knowledge in the Python community. Raspberry Pi, edX, Grok Learning, they're leaders in the worlds of education. And it's a result of all these projects that Python will consistently find a place on most lists of popular programming languages. It's a language that's extremely accessible, but yet it's still a language that's powerful enough to do heavy lifting. Now, it would be really, really easy here for me to launch into a blistering technical critique of JavaScript or Java or Go or Swift and a defense of Python's technical superiority, but I'm not going to do that. Firstly, I don't think it actually adds anything to the discussion. Like it or not, JavaScript, Swift, Java, PHP, these languages exist, they're in widespread use, and their implementations are battle tested. No amount of wailing about WATs is going to make JavaScript, or any other language for that matter, go away. They're here, they're going to stay. Turf arguments like that are also really pointless. History has repeatedly shown us that technical superiority of a technology is very rarely enough to guarantee any sort of victory. AC, DC electricity, Betamax and VHS, Windows and macOS, Windows and OS2, Blu-ray and HD DVD. As long as there are two or more options that meet basic requirements, the social structures and power relationships around the technology are much more important than the technology itself for ensuring success. So, why should we care about Python? And more importantly, why should we care about how we care about Python? We should care because from little things, big things grow. That particular turn of phrase comes from a song from an Australian, white Australian folk singer named Paul Kelly and an Indigenous songwriter named Kev Carmody. The song is almost a literal telling of the story of Vincent Lingiari, who was the leader of the Gurunji workers' strike in Australia. For those who don't know, Australia has quite a damning history when it comes to Indigenous rights. Australian law didn't even recognise Australian Aboriginals as being humans until 1967. The Gurunji strike took place in 1966, just before that, the referendum. It was a non-violent protest by Australian Aboriginals at Wayfield Station, near Alice Springs, right in the red centre of Australia. And they were protesting over pay and work conditions, in particular that they were being exploited on their own land that had been taken from them by white men who had declared that they were savages. The strike ultimately led to the 1976 Australian Land Rights Act, which was the first time that Australian law recognised that Australia was inhabited, that the inhabitants had been dispossessed, and that they had rights over the lands that they were living on for 40,000 years. That whole period is symbolised by this photo, which was at the ceremony where the Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, symbolically poured a handful of dirt into the hand of Vincent Lingiari, symbolically and literally giving the land back to him. What started as a small protest from a handful of Gurunji men saying, we deserve better than this is our land, turned into a political movement that recognised them as people and recognised what they'd been dispossessed of by white settlement. Now, I don't want for a second to claim that open source and Python is as important to the struggle of land rights, as important as the struggle for land rights for Indigenous Australians. And I don't want to claim that the struggle for Indigenous recognition in Australia is over. It isn't by a long way. But that core idea, that optimism about a better future, that from little things, big things grow, shares a lot of similarities to the way that open source projects develop and mature and become successful. Django started as an in-house project at a small regional United States newspaper called the Lawrence Journal World. It wasn't the only web framework. It wasn't the only web framework for Python. It could have very easily been kept in an in-house project of the Journal World and never become anything more than a bespoke internal project. Thankfully, Journal World management took the risk of open sourcing the project, and 12 years and a lot of sweat and blood and tears later, we have the Django that we have today. And big things can, in turn, beget little things, which in turn become big things of their own. In 2014, two well-known members of the Django community, Ola Sitaska and Ola Sendeka, approached me in my capacity at the time as DSF president. They had this really ambitious idea. They wanted to go to EuroPython in Berlin and teach a tutorial for women. They were asking for a $1,500 US grant, which at the time was quite a large grant for the DSF to give. But the DSF took the gamble, and boy did it pay off. From that first event in Berlin in June, there were 14 more by the end of the year, and there have been countless others since, including one on Friday right here in San Juan. They've built a community of thousands of alumni, some of whom are here today. Some of them I recognise from Friday. It's now a self-sustaining financial entity entirely in its own right. Now, we need to be careful of implying causality here. Django has been successful, Django Girls has been successful, and as a result, people will often look to those projects so that they can reverse engineer that success and replicate it. Django's success, just fair warning, was as much a surprise to those that were involved as it was to anybody else. And the failures I've personally had with other projects indicate that I haven't got a magic formula here. I'm still very much learning how to do this. But that's not the same as saying that Django's success was unplanned. The process of developing an open source project requires the founders and contributors to the project to make some very important decisions about the project. Those decisions affect the short-term and long-term viability of the project as a whole. And they need to be treated with that kind of importance, because if they're not going to be made whether you pay, they're going to be made whether you pay attention to them or not. It's just a matter of whether you're actively thinking about those decisions, where you are, and by extension, where you want to end up. As Epictetus said, first decide yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. So, we as a Python community have an opportunity here. Where do we want to be? What change do we want to see in the world? The obvious thing to be concerned about in a technical project is to be the technical things of the nature of the project. You need to have features that people find compelling. You need to have an architecture and design that will serve your project in the long term. And don't get me wrong, that is a very important set of concerns. But, to my mind, much more important are the social issues. As I said earlier, minor differences in technology will rarely guarantee any long-term success for your project. And in many cases, the decision-making process about technical issues is often affected as much by social issues and social decisions as it is by purely technical concerns. Take backwards compatibility, for example. If you spend your life working on short-term contracts, say delivering a website with no long-term maintenance overhead, a promotional website for an event, a site supporting an advertising campaign, you don't have long-term problems. You finish a job, you deploy the site, you move on to the next one. Every time you start again, you're free to try something new, experiment in a different direction, replace something that didn't work well last time. You're looking at the world through glasses that think of 6 months as a really long time. However, if you're engaged in a multi-year project, you really care about maintainability. In a former life, I was involved in the Joint Strike Fighter project. It's a multi-billion-dollar project to develop the next generation fighter for the US and international air forces. And at the point of conception of the project, in 1990, they didn't anticipate delivering a working airframe for 20 years. And yes, they're 7 years late at this point. If you're in this space, you really care about long-term maintenance. You can't use a project that doesn't have a 10-year support plan in place. 6 months is a rounding error in that worldview. Now, that's not to say that one approach is right and one approach is wrong, just that the social properties that you value in your projects depend very much upon your perspective. The technical decisions you make also affect the out-of-the-box experience for new users, the experience a new user has when they discover your project for the first time. A few years back, Kathy Sierra wrote a blog post entitled Attenuation and the Suck Threshold, in which she talks about user engagement on new projects. And what she says is that when you're introducing a person to a new project, you need to make their zero to kick-ass time as small as possible. A new user has to go from knowing as little as possible about your project to kicking a real-world, practical and personally applicable goal as quickly as possible. If that time is low, if they can get over that suck threshold, they will feel like they can do anything. And then, as a result of that, more likely to persist and do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, even if those next steps are progressively harder and harder and harder. The longer that they go, though, the longer that they go before they get that kick-ass moment, though, the more likely they're going to give up, develop a negative impression about your tool or product, and then start telling the world about what a bad project you've got. It's not just about new users though either. Marketing people talk about conversion funnels, and it can help to think about the users of your project in a similar sort of way. You have a universe of users out there who could potentially use your project. Some of those potential users will find your project, will actually try the project. Some of those users will stick around and turn into actual users. Some of those users will stick around and become community members. Some of those will begin to work on your project and become contributors. Some of the contributors will stick around and become core team members. And core team members will eventually turn into community leaders. If you're going to be a vibrant, long-lived project, you want people to work their way down this conversion funnel. Really successful projects like Django have had lots of people work their way down this funnel to the point where the original founders of the project can step away and you don't leave a vacuum at the bottom of the leadership. Part of that out-of-the-box experience and conversion funnel comes down to messaging. It's not just enough to make something theoretically possible, it needs to be practically applicable to the needs of the developer at the time they find your project. The way you talk about your project, the ideas you choose to focus on, the areas where you spend your community's resources, and by extension, the ones you ignore, shape the way your project will be perceived. And that messaging can really frame the success of your entire project. Take, for example, Twisted. Twisted is 17 years old as a library. It's been doing asynchronous behavior this whole time. But it's not until the last couple of years that most people have really started to appreciate what asynchronous means and why it matters. And this is kind of ironic because given 17 years ago, computers and networks were 17 years slower, and they would have made great use of async I/O if we'd all gotten on board. So what changed? Well, why is the world tipped and is now seeking out async? Well, there's something to be said for the power of an idea whose time has come, but another really important reason is messaging. The technical merits of Twisted are not in doubt. But I remember looking at Twisted in 2005, just before I found Django, and I could see lots of pieces that looked like they had something to do with networking and the web, but I couldn't work out how to actually do anything with it and turn out a website. And as a result, I suspect many others, didn't use Twisted, which in turn meant that it wasn't used anywhere near as much as it could have been or should have been until quite recently, which is a pity because Twisted as a technology stack has a lot to offer. Another thing that distinguishes between successful and unsuccessful projects is the extent to which they participate and contribute to a broader ecosystem, rather than being a single tool with a single focus. This is just Metcalfe's law writ large. Metcalfe's law says that the utility of a network increases with the square of the number of participants. Take Django as an example. Django by itself isn't really that exciting. It can do stuff, yes, but it's limited. What's exciting is the ecosystem of packages and tools and the community around it. Every time someone writes a plugin or a library that is part of the Django ecosystem that's compatible with Django in some way, every other package in that ecosystem gains a little bit of value because it's something that's compatible with all the other pieces of the ecosystem. There's almost 4,000 packages on PyPI tagged as being Django compatible libraries. Even if you consider Sturgeon's law that 90% of everything is crap, that's still 400 useful packages on PyPI. Although Metcalfe's law is used to describe telecommunications networks, it also applies to human networks. The more people there are in a community, the more vibrant that community can be. You can't force an ecosystem into existence. The stronger a community, the stronger the ecosystem. Toxic ecosystems either die off or breed nasty subcultures. This is especially true in open source, where pretty much everyone is a volunteer. Your community has to be somewhere that people want to be, or else they will leave. If you are systematically excluding one group of people based upon completely arbitrary distinctions or based upon some preconceived notion of their capabilities or interests, your community is missing out. In web design circles, it's taken a very long time to convince people that accessibility is something worth paying attention to. But it turns out that if you focus on accessibility for your website, not only can the deaf and the blind, the neuroatypical access your website's resources, it improves the experience for everyone else as well. There's a direct analogue here with the social leadership positions that Django and Python have taken as communities. Yes, we have collectively adopted codes of conduct because they are a clear signal to women and minorities that we want our communities to be welcoming and friendly. But as a side effect, it makes the community nicer for everyone. Codes of conduct aren't there to make sure that women can punish men who are all evil. It's there to make sure that everybody, including the white Anglo-Saxon men, have a pleasant experience in a welcoming, friendly community. And you need to make it as easy as possible for as many people to engage in your community. If you need to empower as many people as possible to progress down that conversion funnel as autonomously as possible and feel welcome as they do so. And yeah, some people aren't going to be happy with that. They won't be like being told to be polite or to respect the space and privacy of others or to accept that other people have as much right to be here as they do or have opinions that are just as valid. If those people aren't shown the door, your community will be judged by the behaviour of those who participate in it. And if you want to be part of a community that has those values, well, that's entirely your choice. Just don't expect me to be part of that community. Because no matter how much you make excuses for someone's behaviour because of how talented they are, you're going to be driving away more people, potentially just as talented, but more valuable because they aren't toxic and they are able to form part of larger networks rather than offending everybody they come in contact with. Now, no matter how much you protest that this doesn't happen in our community, it does. If you think it doesn't happen in your backyard, it's because you're not aware of it. Either because you haven't got the mechanisms in place to receive complaints, or you aren't hearing the people when they are complaining. A couple of years ago, I didn't think the Django community had a problem with this sort of thing. I was happy to adopt codes of conduct because people were asking for them, but I didn't think it was a problem we had. It was mostly a token gesture as far as I was concerned. I now have the very dubious distinction of being able to say that I have broken bread with two men who have been the perpetrators of some fairly horrific abuses of women in our community, people who are also my friends. And if you'd asked me about those two men a couple of years ago, I would have said, yeah, they've got a fairly robust sense of humour and they like a bit of a ribald joke and whatnot. But they were mostly harmless. One of those two people has now been convicted of some fairly distasteful crimes as a result of his public behaviour. This is not an abstract concept. And while those sorts of issues, the really extreme ones, are the banner issues that get all the press in discussions about codes of conduct, it's not just about big and obvious offences. Not every code of conduct violation is an egregious sexual assault. It can be much smaller things, small microaggressions, an explicit joke, contempt for another language or tool. It would be really easy to say that the idea of reporting an explicit joke is overreacting and that people should toughen up. But by normalising the complaint process, by demystifying what happens when a complaint is made, making it commonplace for these things to happen, and demonstrating that there is a continuum in these issues, it transforms codes of conduct from being the banhammer you bring out that's only wielded to eject particularly bad people in the community, and turns it into a tool that can be used to start conversations about empathy for our fellow community members. This makes it a whole lot easier to know when a line has been crossed and to flag those problems long before we get to the point where serious problems actually are starting to occur. But it's not enough to just create an ecosystem, to create a safe space for people to participate in that ecosystem. You have to create the conditions that allow that ecosystem to survive in the long term. Speaking personally, community is what keeps me going in open source. It's incredibly energising to come along to events like this one. Hearing about all the cool ways Django is being used, that Beware is being used in the real world is an amazing and humbling experience. And you get to meet all sorts of people, all walks of life. Some of them are truly inspirational, what they're doing. But there comes a time when a project expands beyond the level where it can be supported purely by unpaid volunteers. The expectations of a growing user base, many of whom are now using the project in a commercial context. Talk to any prominent free software developer, and amongst all the success stories, you'll hear some fairly consistent troubles. And in the worst case, those problems have catastrophic consequences. OpenSSL is a software that drives pretty much every secure connection on the internet. But it took the discovery of Heartbleed, a critical vulnerability that sent the whole of the internet into a tailspin before they could find funding to pay for developers. The OpenSSL story ended with a happy ending. It actually got funding. But they don't all have happy endings. Take Capistrano. It was a hugely popular configuration management tool around 2007, 2008, maintained by a guy called Yamas Book. In 2008, citing burnout and maintenance overhead, he famously withdrew support for Windows, saying, Windows may be the 800-pound gorilla in the room, but it's not my gorilla and it's not my room. This was an incredibly unpopular move with Windows users. But even with that scale down that in the project, Jamis burnt out by 2009, he abandoned Capistrano and a whole bunch of other projects without any maintainers. And all the users of those products were left abandoned and they had to find something else. The thing is, this is a community that has lots of cash. In the grand scheme of things, software development is a well-funded industry. If companies can find money for football tables and meditative ball pits, they should be able to find resources to help maintain the software on which they've based their success. And for me, this is the great unanswered question of the free software movement: how to reconcile this discrepancy between the clear demand for a software product, the value that software product provides, and the ability to convert that demand and value into the time and resources needed to service the demand. Although the theory says that anyone can contribute to a free software project, in practice, every single project of any significance has leaders. And at the most basic level, that's whoever has the commit bit. And you need that leadership, especially when anything to do with design is involved. The running gag is that a camel is a horse designed by committee. The worst APIs we deal with on a daily basis are the ones that have been designed by committee. Flat organisational structures aren't organised at all. You need someone to run the show, to set direction, coordinate efforts. The dichotomy between the theory and practice is also the reason why comments like patches are welcome get made in free software mailing lists. On the one hand, yes, it's completely correct. Patches are welcome. But most people don't look at a new open source project that they're using as an opportunity to engage and contribute to a broader community. Most people just want to use the damn software. And you can argue that that's because people are focusing on the wrong interpretation of free and haven't captured the spirit of free software contribution, which is, again, 100% true, but completely counterproductive and useless as an arguing position. Anyone who's done any sort of user experience work knows that if users are consistently making a mistake, blaming the user achieves nothing. You are in charge of the user's experience. And if they made an error, it's because of a fundamental cognitive disconnect between what you think they should be doing and what they think they should be doing. And even if everyone did get the right message, let's be realistic, it wouldn't work anyway. The Mythical Man Month famously had the quote saying, you can't deliver a project you can't deliver a project faster and better by just throwing more people at it. 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month. A project doesn't just need resources, they need the right resources in the right quantities. And ultimately that means projects finding a way to get the resources they need to be self-sustaining. A little under a year ago, Nadia Eghbal published a very extensive report for the Ford Foundation entitled Roads and Bridges, the Unseen Labour Behind Our Digital Infrastructure. The report details in extraordinary detail the challenge that we face as a community. The modern economy relies on digital infrastructure as much as it does on physical infrastructure. But the maintenance of our digital infrastructure is woefully under-resourced. Now, this isn't news to anybody who works in open source, but to date, most open source funding projects have had very, very modest goals. Kickstarter to fund a 2-month code sprint, Patreon for an employee part-time, sales of stickers and shirts to pay for pizza at a sprint night. And these are great, don't get me wrong, but they leave the bigger problem unsolved. Instead of thinking about funding 1 or 2 people to tinker part-time, we need to think about pitching this problem on a much larger scale. There are any number of public good arguments to be made for open source as a philosophy. So, can we tell a collective story that by providing philanthropic or socialised funding for free and open source software, organisations can help make a better world? I think we can, but it's going to take a lot of time and a very distinct strategy to develop that narrative in public debate. And while it would be great if government or philanthropic money got involved, this could also be done by private money, especially given the discussion that's happening in an industry where billion-dollar valuations are kicking around. Large parts of our industry are built on the foundations of free and open source software, but those with the most capacity to contribute, in many cases, aren't contributing at all. There are countless modern success stories that wouldn't be possible without freely available infrastructure. What we haven't got is a culture that encourages and mechanisms to facilitate giving back to communities that have made their lives easier. Now, some companies are doing this. There are companies that do give huge amounts back to open source communities, but there are also a lot of companies that don't. And even those that do give back, many of them give the help that they're able to give, which isn't necessarily the help that is needed. When a natural disaster hits, organisations like the Red Cross call for donations, and they will usually say, please give us money, not food or tins of food or blankets. Why? Because money can buy what is needed. You can't control what people donate. And even if they do happen, coincidentally, to donate exactly the right thing that you need, there's a huge logistic task associated with working out what's been donated and getting it where it's needed. Free and open source projects are much the same. They require resources. Some companies do donate company services. Hosting services is a really good example of this. And that's great, but it's rarely exactly what is needed. And it's easy to get distracted working out what to do with all these resources we've been given, but we don't actually have an immediate need for. And if a company is providing time, that's also great, but most projects don't need 1,000 people donating 1 hour. They need 10 very specific people donating 40 hours. And sadly, just as with charities, many companies don't donate at all. And I'm not necessarily even claiming these companies are being deliberately malicious in not funding open source. If anything, we as a community have failed them because we haven't enabled them to help us. Most importantly, we don't have a mechanism in place to make it easy for companies to spend money and easy for organisations and projects to receive money. The current state of affairs demonstrates that it's not enough that there is actually a lot of money in our community. You have to make the mechanism for spending that money as obvious and seamless as possible. You have to provide a way to spend money in a way that is consistent with corporate accounting processes, and you have to have someone to direct that money towards. One model community that I think does this really well is the WordPress community. WordPress is GPL software. There are books, videos, and blogs about how to write WordPress plugins and themes, the same as there would be for any open source community. But critically, there are also books, videos, and blogs about how to make a business writing WordPress plugins and themes. WordPress is GPL software, and therefore so are all the plugins. But they've got stores where you can buy plugins and get free ones and install them in your WordPress instance. The WordPress ecosystem has fundamentally embraced the idea that money is part of the equation, and in doing so, they've created an industry that is self-funding. And this, I would argue, is one of the key reasons for the success of WordPress as a platform. What we have in free and open source software at the moment is a tragedy of the commons. Everyone agrees that the software is good. Everyone knows the software needs to be maintained. But why should one individual company take on the economic burden of funding maintenance when their competition is getting the benefits for free? So what are we going to do? Well, short answer is I don't know. There probably isn't going to be a single silver bullet. But I firmly believe this conversation about money is a conversation we have to have. Free software as a movement is 30 years old. Open source is almost 20 years old. We've conquered the technical hurdles. We've even conquered things like government policy hurdles. Now it's time to tackle how we make long-term sustainable industry, not just commercial interests exploiting the naivete of a stream of doe-eyed volunteers. Much of the work being done today on Python, and the vast majority of open source projects, is volunteered time. And while there may not be money associated with it, there is still a price. About 18 months ago, I hit rock bottom in what was eventually diagnosed as a major depressive episode. There were a number of underlying causes for my episode, but one of them was the pressures imposed by volunteering on Django. I'm a lot better now than I once was, but I've still got a long way to go. But I'm also not an unusual case. I've almost lost count of the number of talented developers around me who have burnt out or come close under the load imposed by volunteer projects. And in some incredibly tragic cases, people have taken their own lives. This isn't a problem with an easy solution. It isn't as simple as just telling someone they don't have to volunteer anymore. If you're a maintainer of a moderately successful project, I guarantee your inbox is filled with "why haven't you fixed my bug yet" emails, sometimes from people who should know a lot better. That constant deluge can be overwhelming, especially if you're already struggling with finding a work-life balance. And if you're maintaining a high-value project, there's almost certainly some personal pride wrapped up in there as well, in what it is that you're maintaining. There's negotiating the fine balance between volunteering and your career. If I stop volunteering on Django, will I stop being as employable? Anyone who says that it's as simple as just saying stop volunteering, frankly, hasn't been put in a position where that's something they actually have to do. The greatest shocks in society occur when something we assume is plentiful and ubiquitous disappears. Petrol, electricity, clean water. If your open source project isn't planning for the day when your biggest contributor steps down or is unable to continue, then your project has a clock on it. As a community, we need to institutionalise a minimisation of the expectation of free labour. If you've got a project role that's going to take resources, be it material, labour, emotional energy, don't just assume those resources will be available forever in boundless quantity. And if you're a free consumer of those resources, be aware of what it is you're consuming. If you're a commercial organisation who depends on a project and you aren't taking steps to contribute to that project that you use, then I argue you are being criminally negligent to your customers and investors because you haven't secured your supply chain. You haven't mitigated a key risk associated with your technology stack. But it's not just about finger pointing at bad projects or bad users or bad companies. As a community, we haven't established the conditions where companies are able to mitigate these risks. The free software community has spent a lot of time and effort discussing and defending the importance of user freedoms. However, they've been almost silent on the unintended consequences of that position, that when software is free as in freedom, it is almost always free as in beer as well, which means the task of making an income off that software is much higher. The ultimate effect of this position is that free software really is free as in puppy. It's something that you gladly pick up when the project is young because, who doesn't love a cute little cuddly puppy project? Even if it does, sometimes it whizzes on your rug, okay. But as that puppy gets older, it gets bigger. It takes up more and more of your time. It gets ratty and starts destroying your couch if you don't take it for a walk. And sometimes it gets ratty and just destroys your couch just because. You can't abandon it. It's a living, breathing thing. But somehow this thing that you picked up for free has all of a sudden taken over your entire life. I don't want to undersell the importance of user freedoms, but to focus on user freedom to the detriment of the mental and physical health of the developers of the software is, in my opinion, incredibly negligent. How to make money from free software isn't a question that has good answers at the moment. As a community, we need to have a very serious discussion about the economic consequences of our decisions and how to harness the not insignificant resources that the software community has at its disposal. The good news is that there is an unexpected benefit to facing this problem head on. Finding a way to pay for the resources that we are consuming certainly helps to stave off burnout, but it has the added benefit that it broadens the list of people who can actually do the work. Volunteers, by definition, are made up by people who have time to volunteer. If you've got a family, if you've got children, if you've got loved ones that need care, those commitments take priority, as well they should. You want to address, and that limits your ability to volunteer. You want to address diversity? Make sure that you're not just drawing from the pool of people who have copious amounts of free time, which, broadly speaking, means white, Anglo-Saxon, middle to upper class men aged 16 to 30. If you're someone who uses open source, don't just take from the community, give back in tangible ways, either with hard commitments of time or with cash that organisations like the PSF and the DSF can use. This is especially important if you are a large organisation that has extraordinary resources at your disposal who derive immense benefit from open source and volunteer projects. So, what does the future hold for Python? Well, short answer is I don't know. I've outlined what I think are the threats and opportunities that we face as a community, but I'm just one voice. I'm very keen to make sure this community doesn't go away. Strong communities take a long time to develop. The Python community is 25 years old. Django is 12 years old. And it would be a shame to have to start all over again, to rebuild this all from scratch, simply because we didn't pay attention to the way the world is changing around us and what we needed, the ways we needed to respond to maintain a healthy community. The real effect of the things we're doing today, the real effect of the things we're doing to these communities probably won't be seen for years, maybe even another generation. But from the little things we do today in our communities, big things can and will grow. Myself, I intend to keep working on Beware. If you'd like to get involved, I'd certainly appreciate any help. There's plenty to do. And I've got an open offer to mentor anybody who wants to get involved as well, even if it's your first time contributing to an open source project. And as an added bonus, thanks to Revolution Systems, anyone who does contribute gets an exclusive Beware Challenge coin. So come and talk to me if you'd like to get one of those. I'm also exploring the options for turning Beware into a model of a new style of financially viable but socially responsible open source organisation. You can sign up for our mailing list, or you can, if you're already sold, there's membership forms on our website. If you'd like to discuss bigger plans, please grab me. I'd love to have a chat about this. As I've gotten older, as I've seen my children grow up, as I've lost friends through burnout, I've had some very uncomfortable revelations about other people. It's become increasingly apparent to me how short our time on this planet is and how important it is to make our time count. Back home in Perth, I'm a member of a shared workspace called Space Cubed, and as you walk through the front doors, this quote is painted on the wall. A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. Now, okay, gender language notwithstanding, and it's a little sad that I'm starting to have old man thoughts at the ripe old age of 40, but every time I walk through that door, I realise how profound it is. I aspire to be a planter of trees. What I do today with my open source contributions is about so much more than just scratching an itch. I certainly hope that today I've been able to inspire you to plant some of your own trees. Thank you very much.